Something is attacking relationships, and most people never see it until the damage is already done. Have you noticed the sudden coldness, the unexplained arguments, the emotional distance that appeared out of nowhere? What if the problem is not just emotional, but spiritual? Tonight, hidden attacks will be exposed, patterns the enemy uses to divide love, destroy covenant, and drain peace from your home. An ex-occult insider once revealed that some relationships are targeted long before the couple even realizes they are under attack. And if you ignore these signs, you may be fighting your partner while the real enemy hides in the shadows. One of the first signs your relationship may be under spiritual attack is this: a strange hatred begins to grow where love once lived. Not normal frustration, not ordinary disagreements, something darker, something unnatural. You wake up one morning and the person you once prayed for suddenly irritates you for no reason. Their voice angers you. Their presence exhausts you. Small things become explosive triggers. Tiny misunderstandings become emotional warfare. And the terrifying part is this: you cannot explain why it is happening. Many relationships do not collapse overnight. They are spiritually weakened first. The enemy studies patterns. He watches wounds. He searches for openings. And once division enters a relationship, confusion follows behind it like a shadow. Some people think witchcraft only works through rituals, candles, spoken curses. But spiritual attacks often begin in the mind. A thought enters, then another, then suspicion, then emotional withdrawal, then silence, then offense. And suddenly two people who once fought for each other are now fighting against each other. You must understand this carefully. Not every relationship problem is caused by witchcraft. But when destruction appears suddenly, irrationally, and aggressively, you must spiritually discern what is happening. Because some attacks are engineered to break emotional unity. There are relationships where love was strong for years, then suddenly everything changed. No major betrayal, no clear reason. Yet the atmosphere became heavy, conversations became hostile, affection disappeared, peace vanished. And many couples never realize they are under spiritual oppression until the damage becomes severe. There are people listening right now who remember the exact moment things shifted. It felt sudden. Coldness entered your home. You started feeling emotionally disconnected. Your partner became someone you no longer recognized. Even intimacy changed. The emotional bond weakened. The communication became poisoned. And no matter how hard you tried to fix things naturally, the confusion only deepened. That is how spiritual attacks operate. They create emotional smoke so you cannot identify the real fire. One woman shared that every single night she and her husband would begin arguing after midnight. Not occasionally, constantly. During the daytime they were calm, but late at night rage appeared. Words they never planned to say came out violently. The home atmosphere felt oppressive, heavy, dark, draining. They thought it was stress. They thought it was personality conflict. But later they discovered that someone deeply jealous of their marriage had been engaging in spiritual practices against them for months. And the moment they began praying together consistently, everything started changing. Because darkness cannot comfortably remain where spiritual authority is activated. This is why the enemy fears unity. A spiritually united couple becomes difficult to destroy, so division becomes the primary weapon. One partner becomes emotionally distant, the other becomes reactive. Misunderstandings multiply, pride increases, communication collapses, and eventually both people become emotionally exhausted. Then the enemy whispers the final lie: maybe you were never meant for each other. But many times the relationship did not fail because love disappeared. It failed because spiritual attacks went unrecognized. You must pay attention to repeated patterns, especially when they make no logical sense. Do arguments erupt over insignificant things constantly? Does peace disappear the moment both of you enter the same room? Do you feel emotional heaviness around your relationship that you cannot explain? Do outsiders seem strangely obsessed with your downfall? Some spiritual attacks operate through jealousy, others through manipulation, others through spoken curses, and some through intentional division sent by people who secretly resent your happiness. There are people who smile publicly while privately wishing destruction over your relationship. Never underestimate the power of envy mixed with darkness. Not everyone celebrating you truly wants you to win. And this is why discernment matters, because some relationships are not merely facing emotional pressure, they are under targeted spiritual resistance. Another dangerous sign is constant misunderstanding. You explain yourself clearly, yet somehow your words become twisted. You try to bring peace, yet conflict increases. It feels like communication itself has become corrupted. This is one of the oldest tactics used in spiritual warfare: confusion. Because confusion weakens trust, and once trust weakens, fear enters easily. Then suspicion grows, then emotional walls rise, then isolation begins. And isolation is dangerous, because isolated people become spiritually vulnerable. That is why spiritually attacked relationships often stop praying together. They stop communicating deeply. They stop protecting emotional intimacy. Slowly the connection dies, not because love was fake, but because the attack was persistent. Some of you have already noticed these signs: the exhaustion, the emotional instability, the strange cycles, the repeated arguments that seem to appear from nowhere. And tonight you must stop blaming yourself for everything without spiritually examining what is happening around you. Because sometimes the real battle is invisible. There are relationships where nightmares began increasing right before major conflict started. Others noticed strange fear, anxiety, or emotional heaviness entering the home. Some experienced constant bad timing, financial stress, emotional breakdowns, and increasing temptation all at once. Why? Because spiritual attacks rarely come alone. They come layered. The goal is pressure, relentless pressure, until the relationship collapses under emotional exhaustion. But hear this clearly: darkness is not invincible. Attacks can be broken, division can be exposed, peace can return. But first, you must recognize the war. You cannot fight what you refuse to identify. Stop dismissing every strange pattern as coincidence. Stop ignoring repeated spiritual warning signs. And stop fighting each other while the real enemy hides behind the conflict. Sometimes the greatest victory in a relationship begins when two people finally realize we are not each other's enemy. The moment that revelation happens, spiritual power begins to rise again. Because unity weakens darkness, prayer weakens oppression, truth destroys confusion, and spiritual authority breaks attacks that were sent to destroy your connection. The enemy wants silence, he wants pride, he wants emotional distance. But when two people stand together spiritually, the atmosphere begins to change. Peace returns, clarity returns, strength returns. And what was sent to destroy the relationship begins to lose power. One of the most dangerous signs of spiritual attack against a relationship is this: a sudden emotional connection to someone outside the relationship begins forming out of nowhere. And it happens fast, too fast. The attraction feels unnatural, intense, obsessive. You start thinking about someone constantly even when you never cared about them before. Your emotions begin shifting away from the person you once loved. And the frightening part is this: you know something feels wrong, but you cannot seem to break free from the pull. Many spiritually attacked relationships are not destroyed by direct hatred first. They are destroyed through distraction. The enemy understands something most people ignore. If he cannot break the relationship through conflict, he will attempt to corrupt it through temptation. This is why some people suddenly become emotionally vulnerable at the exact moment their relationship begins facing pressure. The attacks become coordinated. Arguments increase at home. Communication weakens. Loneliness grows. Then suddenly another person appears offering attention, comfort, validation, or emotional escape. And what looks natural on the surface may actually be spiritually manipulated underneath. Because not every emotional connection is innocent. Some are strategically timed distractions. You must understand this carefully. Spiritual attacks often target weak emotional moments: after disappointment, after rejection, after exhaustion, after repeated conflict. That is when temptation becomes dangerous, because wounded emotions crave relief, and the enemy knows exactly how to present counterfeit comfort. Many people who fell into destructive relationships later admitted something shocking. They said the attraction felt irrational, almost addictive. They could not explain why they became emotionally attached so quickly, even when the connection was toxic, even when warning signs were obvious, even when peace disappeared. The emotional pull remained powerful. This is why discernment matters, because some emotional bonds are not rooted in genuine love. They are rooted in spiritual manipulation. There are relationships where one partner suddenly changes completely after meeting a certain person. Their behavior shifts, their loyalty weakens, their personality becomes colder, their emotional energy moves elsewhere, and people around them notice the difference immediately, almost as if another influence entered their life. Sometimes spiritual attacks operate through seduction. Not only physical seduction, but emotional seduction. Someone begins feeding the ego. Someone begins creating emotional dependency. Someone begins positioning themselves as the safe place while secretly pulling the relationship apart piece by piece. And many victims never realize they are being spiritually drawn away until the damage becomes severe. One man shared how deeply in love he was with his wife for years. They prayed together, built together, survived hardships together. Then suddenly he met a coworker. At first it seemed harmless, simple conversations, small emotional connection, nothing serious. But within weeks his emotions became consumed. He started hiding messages, becoming emotionally distant at home, growing irritated with his wife for no reason. And eventually he admitted something terrifying. He said it felt like his mind was constantly being pulled somewhere else, like he was losing control over his own emotional stability. The relationship at home became colder, while the unhealthy attachment grew stronger. This is how spiritual attacks quietly operate, not always through dramatic manifestations, sometimes through subtle emotional corruption, slowly, patiently. Strategically, the enemy understands that once emotional loyalty is broken, the relationship becomes vulnerable to collapse. This is why spiritually attacked relationships often experience repeated cycles of temptation, not coincidence, patterns. One temptation leaves, another appears, then another, especially during moments of emotional weakness. And social media has intensified this danger. Many people unknowingly open spiritual doors through constant emotional comparison. They begin fantasizing about other lifestyles, other relationships, other people. Dissatisfaction grows silently. And suddenly the relationship they once valued begins feeling boring or empty. But often the problem is not the relationship. The problem is spiritual contamination entering through the mind. You cannot constantly feed your mind confusion and expect emotional clarity. What enters your spirit eventually influences your decisions. This is why guarding your emotional gates matters. Some people are entertaining conversations they should have had months ago. Some are keeping emotional connections alive just in case. Others are secretly addicted to attention outside their relationship. And every hidden compromise weakens spiritual protection, because secrecy feeds darkness. You may think nobody notices, but spiritually hidden compromise creates openings. And once the enemy gains emotional access, confusion increases rapidly. That is why some people suddenly lose peace after entertaining unhealthy connections. Their emotions become unstable, their discernment weakens, their home atmosphere changes, guilt increases, frustration increases, distance increases, because spiritually divided hearts cannot maintain peace for long. There are also attacks designed to create emotional numbness between couples. Affection disappears suddenly, intimacy weakens, conversations feel forced, one or both partners become emotionally detached. And while the relationship weakens internally, outside temptations begin appearing aggressively. This is not random. The enemy attacks weakened areas and relationships under spiritual pressure must become extremely careful during emotionally vulnerable seasons. You cannot ignore warning signs, especially when your emotional patterns suddenly change. Ask yourself honestly, have you become emotionally attached to someone you never expected? Have strange fantasies begun controlling your thoughts? Do you constantly compare your partner to someone else? Has temptation increased during conflict inside your relationship? These signs should never be ignored casually, because spiritual attacks thrive in secrecy, and secrecy grows strongest where honesty disappears. This is why transparency matters, prayer matters, spiritual discipline matters. Not religion without power. Real spiritual awareness, real discernment, real protection over your heart and mind. Many relationships could have been saved if compromise was confronted early, before emotional affairs developed, before trust collapsed, before secret attachments became addictions. The enemy wants emotional fragmentation. He wants divided affection. He wants hidden conversations. He wants fantasy replacing covenant. Because once emotional loyalty breaks, destruction accelerates. But hear this carefully tonight. Temptation does not have to become destiny. Spiritual attacks can be resisted. Emotional confusion can be broken. Counterfeit connections can lose power. But only when truth is faced directly. Some people keep asking why their relationship feels cursed while secretly entertaining those that invite destruction. You cannot protect a relationship while feeding the very thing destroying it. There comes a moment where spiritual discipline becomes survival, where emotional honesty becomes necessary, where cutting off toxic influence becomes urgent, because some people around you are not sent to help your relationship. They are sent to weaken it. And if you ignore discernment long enough, emotional blindness will eventually cost you peace. One of the strongest things a person can say during spiritual warfare is this: I refuse to destroy what God gave me just because temptation appeared. That kind of decision weakens darkness immediately, because spiritual attacks lose power when people stop cooperating with them. And tonight, some people need to recognize that the battle over their relationship is not only emotional, it is spiritual. The enemy is not after a simple argument, he is after destruction, division, isolation, broken trust, broken homes, broken futures. Attacks exposed lose their power. And when truth enters, confusion begins to collapse. Another major sign your relationship may be under spiritual attack is this: everything begins falling apart at the same time, not just emotionally, but financially, mentally, physically. Suddenly, the relationship feels surrounded by chaos. One problem after another, one setback after another. No breathing room, no peace. It feels like the moment you try to move forward, something immediately pushes you backward again. Many people never recognize this pattern because they only look at individual problems separately. But spiritually discerning people notice something deeper. The attacks become concentrated, layered, relentless. The relationship enters a cycle where pressure never seems to stop. Unexpected bills appear constantly. Jobs become unstable. Opportunities collapse suddenly. Plans fail repeatedly. Arguments increase under financial stress. Emotional exhaustion rises. And slowly the relationship begins suffocating under the weight of constant pressure. You must understand something critical. The enemy knows stressed people make emotional decisions. When exhaustion increases, patience weakens. When fear increases, unity weakens. And when survival pressure becomes overwhelming, relationships become vulnerable to division. This is why spiritually attacked relationships often experience multiple forms of warfare simultaneously: financial pressure, emotional instability, mental fatigue, unexpected conflict, sleep problems, fear, discouragement. And over time, people begin asking dangerous questions. Why does everything go wrong for us? Why can't we ever move forward? Why does peace disappear every time things start improving? That hopelessness is part of the attack, because prolonged pressure is designed to drain faith. The enemy wants couples emotionally exhausted, too tired to pray, too frustrated to communicate, too discouraged to fight spiritually. One woman described it this way: every time she and her fiancé tried to make progress toward marriage, something disastrous happened: a job loss, a medical emergency, family conflict, car trouble, unexpected death. And the pressure became so constant that they started turning against each other, not because they stopped loving each other, but because survival stress consumed their emotional energy. This is how spiritual attacks slowly poison relationships, not always through dramatic manifestations, sometimes through relentless pressure designed to weaken unity over time. You start blaming each other for problems neither of you created. Frustration turns into resentment. Resentment turns into emotional distance. And eventually, both people become mentally drained. There are relationships where the atmosphere itself feels cursed. Every plan collapses. Every breakthrough gets interrupted. Every season of peace becomes short lived. And after enough disappointment, people begin accepting chaos as normal. That is one of the enemy's greatest victories. When people normalize spiritual oppression, when dysfunction becomes familiar, when constant struggle becomes expected. Because once people lose hope for peace, they stop fighting for freedom. Some people listening tonight have noticed repeated strange patterns around their relationship. Every major milestone becomes difficult. Every attempt to grow faces resistance. And outsiders seem strangely invested in your downfall. Never underestimate the spiritual effect of jealousy and spoken negativity. There are people who celebrate publicly while privately releasing bitterness, envy, and destructive words over your relationship. Words carry spiritual weight, especially repeated negative declarations. This is why some homes feel emotionally heavy after certain visitors leave. Some conversations leave confusion lingering for days. Some environments drain peace immediately. Spiritually sensitive people recognize atmosphere because not every environment carries the same spiritual influence. There are homes filled with tension, homes filled with fear, homes filled with hidden darkness. And when relationships remain exposed to spiritually toxic environments long enough, emotional pressure increases. That is why discernment about people, environments, and influences matters deeply. Not everyone should have access to your relationship. Not everyone should hear your private struggles. Some people secretly feed on relational chaos. They enjoy division. They encourage offense. They fuel suspicion. And spiritually attacked relationships become even weaker when toxic voices constantly surround them. Another dangerous sign is constant mental exhaustion. You feel drained all the time, heavy, unmotivated, emotionally unstable. Small issues suddenly feel overwhelming. Simple decisions become difficult. And peace feels distant no matter how hard you try to rest. Many people think this is only stress. Sometimes it is, but spiritually oppressed environments often create unusual emotional heaviness, especially at night. Some people experience sudden anxiety before sleeping. Others experience disturbing dreams. Others wake up angry, fearful, or emotionally restless without explanation. The relationship atmosphere becomes tense even during quiet moments. And if these patterns continue unchecked, emotional breakdown becomes easier. Because exhausted people lose perspective. This is why spiritual warfare often targets rest. Sleep deprivation weakens discernment. Mental exhaustion weakens emotional stability. And unstable emotions create relational vulnerability. The enemy studies pressure points carefully. He knows when couples are financially weak, emotionally weak, mentally weak, and attacks often intensify during vulnerable seasons, especially before major breakthroughs. Many relationships face their strongest warfare right before progress, right before marriage, right before healing, right before restoration, right before elevation. Because darkness fears united people with purpose. And some of you need to hear this clearly tonight. Not every setback means you are defeated. Not every delay means your relationship is doomed. Some battles intensify because something valuable is being targeted. The enemy does not waste energy attacking what carries no purpose. This is why spiritually strong couples learn something powerful. They stop fighting each other during pressure and start fighting together against the pressure. That changes everything. Because unity disrupts spiritual attacks, prayer disrupts confusion, agreement disrupts division, and peace begins returning when two people stop allowing chaos to control the atmosphere of the relationship. Some couples unknowingly magnify attacks because every hardship becomes internal conflict. Money problems become personal attacks. Stress becomes emotional aggression. Fear becomes blame. And eventually the relationship becomes a battlefield instead of a place of protection. But spiritually mature people recognize something important. Your partner is not always the source of the pressure. Sometimes both of you are under attack simultaneously. That realization changes how you respond during difficult seasons. Instead of attacking each other, you begin protecting each other. Instead of feeding division, you build unity. Instead of surrendering to chaos, you spiritually confront it together. And that kind of agreement is powerful. There are testimonies from couples who said everything began changing once they stopped speaking negativity constantly. They removed toxic voices, prayed together consistently, protected their environment, became more spiritually alert, and slowly the atmosphere shifted. Peace returned, clarity returned, strength returned, because darkness weakens where spiritual authority becomes active. But many people wait too long before recognizing the battle. They allow stress to harden their hearts. They allow disappointment to create bitterness. And eventually, hopelessness settles into the relationship like poison. Tonight, that cycle must break. You cannot allow constant chaos to convince you that destruction is inevitable. You cannot surrender your peace simply because pressure became intense. And you cannot continue ignoring spiritual patterns that repeatedly surround your relationship. Some attacks are real, some oppression is intentional. But hear this carefully. Pressure is not permission to give up. Chaos is not proof that darkness has won. And attacks do not last forever when spiritually confronted correctly. The enemy wants emotional collapse. But spiritually aware couples learn how to stand together during storms. And when unity survives pressure, relationships become stronger than the attacks sent against them. One of the final and most dangerous signs your relationship is under spiritual attack is this: the spiritual connection begins dying first. Before the relationship collapses emotionally, it weakens spiritually. Prayer disappears, conviction weakens, discernment fades, and slowly the relationship becomes disconnected from spiritual protection. This is how many attacks fully enter. Not suddenly at all, gradually, quietly. The enemy understands something many people ignore. A spiritually strong relationship is difficult to destroy. So the first objective is separation from spiritual covering. Because once prayer disappears, vulnerability increases. Couples once prayed together consistently, spoke life over each other, protected their home spiritually. But over time, distractions entered. Busyness increased, stress increased, conflict increased, and eventually spiritual discipline disappeared completely. At first, it seemed small, just missing prayer occasionally, just becoming spiritually tired, just losing consistency. But slowly the atmosphere changed. Peace weakened, patience weakened, communication weakened, and emotional attacks became stronger. This is not coincidence, because spiritual neglect creates open doors. You cannot starve your spiritual life and expect emotional stability to remain strong forever. Many relationships are trying to survive spiritual warfare with no spiritual defense. No prayer, no discernment, no spiritual awareness, only emotion, only reaction, only frustration, and eventually the relationship begins collapsing under invisible pressure. One man admitted that the moment he stopped praying over his home regularly, everything shifted. He became angrier, more impatient, more emotionally distant. Arguments increased constantly, temptation increased aggressively, fear entered his thoughts repeatedly, and the peace inside the home disappeared almost completely. He later said something chilling. It felt like darkness slowly moved in while we were distracted. That is exactly how spiritual attacks often operate, quietly, patiently, while people are spiritually asleep. Some couples no longer feel peace in their own home. Silence feels uncomfortable, tension fills the atmosphere. Even during normal conversations, there is irritation beneath the surface. And sometimes both people feel emotionally trapped but cannot explain why. That heaviness should never be ignored. Because spiritually oppressed relationships often lose peace before they lose love. You may still care deeply about each other, yet the relationship feels suffocated, drained, restless, constantly under emotional pressure. Without spiritual intervention, the attacks intensify over time. Another major warning sign is the sudden loss of spiritual hunger. You stop praying, stop reading scripture, stop seeking spiritual clarity. Everything becomes emotionally driven instead of spiritually grounded. And once discernment weakens, deception becomes easier. The enemy loves spiritually distracted relationships because distracted people stop noticing danger. They normalize dysfunction. They ignore warning signs, become emotionally reactive instead of spiritually aware. And eventually, confusion controls the relationship atmosphere. Some people listening right now remember when peace used to exist naturally in the relationship. Conversations felt lighter, affection felt genuine, spiritual connection felt alive. But now everything feels heavy, cold. You sit near each other physically while feeling emotionally miles apart. That kind of spiritual distance is dangerous because isolation creates vulnerability. And spiritually attacked relationships often experience silent emotional separation long before physical separation happens. The enemy wants couples disconnected emotionally, mentally, and spiritually because divided people struggle to fight together. This is why prayer together becomes a threat to darkness. Not empty religious performance, real spiritual agreement, real unity, real authority. Many spiritually oppressed relationships begin changing the moment both people seriously pray together again. Not casually, not mechanically, seriously. Because prayer exposes hidden attacks, prayer restores discernment, prayer breaks emotional confusion, and prayer shifts atmospheres that negativity has controlled for months or even years. Some people underestimate spiritual atmosphere completely, but atmosphere matters. You can feel when peace leaves a home. You can feel when tension dominates a relationship. You can feel when emotional heaviness settles into conversations constantly. Spiritually sensitive people recognize when something invisible is influencing visible behavior. And this is why protecting the atmosphere of your relationship matters deeply. What enters your home spiritually matters. What constantly plays in your environment matters. The voices surrounding your relationship matter. The energy you entertain emotionally matters. Because repeated exposure shapes spiritual atmosphere over time. Some couples continuously feed darkness through constant negativity, insults, mockery, bitterness, threats, toxic entertainment, constant conflict. And eventually the home atmosphere becomes emotionally toxic. Then they wonder why peace disappeared. Peace cannot thrive where destruction is constantly fed. And spiritually attacked relationships become even weaker when negative cycles remain unchallenged. There are also relationships where one partner suddenly becomes resistant to anything spiritual. Prayer becomes uncomfortable, worship becomes irritating, conversations about faith create tension, and spiritually significant moments seem constantly interrupted. This resistance sometimes reveals deeper spiritual conflict happening beneath the surface. Because darkness resists environments where spiritual authority becomes active, you must pay attention to patterns, especially repeated spiritual resistance. Some people only seek spiritual help after years of damage, after trust is broken, after emotional wounds deepen, after separation already begins. But wisdom recognizes attacks early, before destruction fully develops, before emotional distance becomes permanent, before bitterness hardens the heart completely. Tonight, some people need to understand this clearly. Your relationship cannot survive ongoing spiritual warfare while spiritually disconnected. Love alone is not enough. Attraction alone is not enough. Emotion alone is not enough. Relationships under spiritual attack require spiritual strength. And spiritually mature couples learn how to protect peace intentionally. They pray even when tired, communicate even when frustrated, forgive even when offended, discern influences carefully, protect emotional intimacy, and refuse to allow darkness to divide them easily, because they understand something powerful. Unity is spiritual warfare. Every time you choose understanding over hatred, you weaken division. Every time you choose honesty over secrecy, you weaken manipulation. Every time you choose prayer over despair, you weaken darkness. The enemy wants you emotionally numb, spiritually disconnected, mentally exhausted, hopeless. Because hopeless people stop fighting for restoration. But tonight, restoration is still possible. Peace is still possible. Healing is still possible. Attacks exposed can be confronted. Strongholds can be broken. Emotional confusion can end. And relationships that looked spiritually suffocated can breathe again. But someone must recognize the battle honestly. Someone must stop feeding division. Someone must stop normalizing chaos. Someone must rise spiritually and protect what is being attacked. Because not every relationship is failing from lack of love. Some are under relentless spiritual pressure. And once that truth is recognized, everything begins changing. Tonight, the hidden attacks have been exposed. What tried to divide you does not have the final word. You are not powerless against darkness, confusion, emotional manipulation, or spiritual oppression. The moment you recognize the battle, you stop fighting blindly. Stand together, pray together, protect your peace fiercely. Every attack sent against your relationship can be confronted with spiritual authority, truth, and unwavering unity. And what was meant to destroy your bond will become the very thing that reveals your strength, your discernment, and your victory.